Hello and welcome back to Bitesize Boxing. So today I would like to talk about the Fabio Wardley-Joseph Parker fight, or really should I say the Joseph Parker versus Fabio Wardley fight, taking place this Saturday in the O2 Arena. So I initially previewed this fight when it was first announced. It must have been 6 weeks ago, something like that. And I have to say it's a bit of a strange one because not only was the fight, it kind of came from left field, but it was announced, and then I think there's been a few, cards in between, and I kind of blinked, and here it is, it's fight week. It's come around very, very quick, and I have to be honest, I don't know what it's like in your corner of the world, but there hasn't been a lot of hype for this fight, particularly here in the UK, considering it's taking place here, and considering this is, at least from a headliner's perspective, probably one of the bigger cards we've had this year. I mean, when you look at the schedule, you've just got Eubank Ben, and that's it. This is probably the second to last big fight we've got on these shores until maybe something in January, but January tends to be a quiet month normally in boxing, so it could be February, you know what I mean? So it's strange that there's not really much more buzz, but I think part of that probably comes down to the card. The card isn't very good, and also the fact this is on pay-per-view, and a lot of us here in the UK, understandably, have pay-per-view fatigue, because we are constantly getting this slew of pay-per-views after pay-per-views, and they're pay-per-views that are just not worth it, and this is another one of those. So I think it's an amalgamation of a few factors. I also, as I've touched on in other videos, I feel like the whole scene in British boxing is kind of on a downwards trajectory a little bit. And so I think when you kind of marry all those things together, particularly when you add things even like the economic aspect, I think you can see why maybe it's not quite got the buzz that this would have had a few years ago. But that being said, it's still a very good fight. And I'm happy to talk about this fight in isolation and kind of just talk about my thoughts on it. I did do an initial reaction when it was first announced, and that went down really, really well. A lot of you guys really, really enjoyed that video, and there was a lot of really good feedback on it. And so I thought for fight week, I probably should talk about the fight and maybe give my thoughts in a little bit more detail. But I have to be honest, just from the outside looking in, starting off, my thoughts on the fight haven't really changed. I still kind of feel largely the same about the fight as I did before. It's one of those fights that when you look at it from both guys' perspectives, it does make sense. For Fabio Wardley, this is a shot in the dark. This will essentially be, a final eliminator for him, more or less. He either gets elevated to a title if the belts go everywhere, or he ends up fighting for a world title against someone like Usyk if he decides to hold on to the belts. So either way, for Fabio Wardley, this is a brilliant opportunity. And for Joseph Parker, he's obviously got that mandatory position now locked down. And so this is essentially just a relatively safe, as you would expect, stay busy fight. And I say relatively safe because, yes, Fabio Wardley is on a good run, but stylistically, you would expect Joseph Parker to have far too much for Fabio Wardley. Fabio Wardley, of course, has done very well. He's come from the white collar scene, which, if you're not from the UK, is essentially almost like semi-pro. One of my close friends actually used to box white collar, and it's kind of, you get people who, they get given maybe a 6-week course, crash course in boxing, and they learn to box, and then they'll box other people of similar ability. That is the scene in which Fabio Wardley came from, it's done for charity and that kind of stuff. So to come from that scene and to very, very quickly kind of establish yourself as no worse than a top 20, top 15 heavyweight is pretty impressive, really. And it's one of the few stories of this that we've really seen. The only other person who springs to mind who's done something similar would be Anthony Yard, who come from the Queensberry Boxing League scene, which was a similar kind of thing. Other than that, you don't really tend to get these guys who have absolutely no amateur careers, particularly in the West. In Mexico, it's far more common. But here, he hasn't taken the Mexican method. The Mexican method, yes, they might have no amateur career, but they'll have 40, 50 fights or something crazy, maybe not 50 fights, I'm exaggerating a bit, but, 30, 40 fights, then they'll go in there at world level or higher levels. Whereas Fabio Wardley, this is a guy who's going in there against a world level fighter, and he's only got, he's 19-1. So it's pretty impressive for Fabio Wardley. Of course, that one being a draw against Fraser Clark. And so, yeah, look, Fabio Wardley's coming off good form, but I think from the start, you can kind of see his limitations. Because of that lack of amateur experience, technically he is very limited. He punches very hard. He's got very good athleticism, actually. I think that's something that's quite underrated about Fabio Wardley. He's quite a fluid heavyweight. He moves very quickly, he's very agile in there. But because he hasn't got that schooling, a lot of his movements and kind of his body mechanics are almost novice-y. And I know that sounds weird because your body mechanics is more your movement. But when you see someone who's a lot more technically refined and comfortable in the ring, that they can kind of loosen up and relax a little bit. Fabio Wardley is a lot more tense in the ring, and he kind of tenses up a bit more, and that makes it look a little bit novice-y, particularly after a few rounds when he gets ragged. You know, if you've ever seen a guy who is, say, a white-collar boxer or something, you'll see that their construct breaks down very quickly, and they kind of have these, again, just novice-y moves. You know, they're not somebody who can, you know, relax, keep a low lift hand, you know, shoot it out like that kind of thing. After a few rounds, that goes out the window, and Fabio Wardley is a little bit like that. You know, the way he holds his guard, the way he kind of, you know, puts his punches together, it all looks a little bit awkward, and you'd expect that because, again, this guy just hasn't had the amateur schooling. I think, you know, Fabio Wardley's only been boxing for something crazy like 10 years or something like that, less than that. So to be going in there at world level is pretty impressive. Then we, of course, have Joseph Parker. Joseph Parker really needs no introduction. He's on a very good run himself. Joseph Parker's last 3 fights, of course, being Martin Bakole, Zhilei Zhang and Deontay Wilder. 3 fantastic wins on paper. But I would like to interject and say that although they have been really good wins, I take a slightly unpopular approach in that I do think that he's flattered to deceive in these fights. The Deontay Wilder fight, Deontay Wilder, not that we knew it necessarily going into that fight, has turned out to be completely shot. So Deontay Wilder was a spent force going into that fight. The Zhilei Zhang fight, I think people forget, was actually a majority decision. And although you might say that that was, you know, dubious, the decision, Joseph Parker got dropped twice in that fight, you know, so it wasn't like he had it all his own way, you know. There's a lot of revisionism around that fight, you know. People talk that, like, Joseph Parker just outboxed Zhilei Zhang for 12 rounds and it was a complete shutout. I mean, it was relatively close on the cards and he got dropped a couple of times, you know, he got hurt in that fight. So, again, it's not really, you know, the clean-cut win that people will make out. And then you've got the Martin Bakole fight, which for me was a write-off. There's no point even discussing it because Martin Bakole came in absolutely gross shape. This took place in, what was it, end of March? No, end of February. And Martin Bakole hadn't even sparred since August. And he came in at, what, 310 pounds, something like that, in absolutely gross shape. No, you know, shouldn't have been in the ring. He was jet lagged. He'd just flown around the world. He'd been traveling for, what, 2 nights with no sleep. I mean, and I like Joseph Parker and I like what he's doing, and I really like the way he's rebounded and rebuilt, particularly after the nature of that devastating loss to Joe Joyce. But I do see some people go overboard because they'll take those 3 names in isolation and they'll pretend that it was the best Deontay Wilder. You know, the Zhilei Zhang win was a masterclass and he outboxed him over 12 without getting touched. And then Martin Bakole, well, he was the boogeyman and he knocked out the best version of Bakole early. And this is how a lot of people kind of talk. And I think that's a little bit... I think that's a little bit, you know, you're stretching it a little bit. Yes, they were good wins. But again, when you kind of zoom out and you look at those wins in context, then they're good, don't get it twisted, but they're not as amazing as some people will make out. There are caveats to all 3 of those wins. That being said, they are 3 very good wins, and I do think Joseph Parker, on the balance of play, when you look at that kind of thing, he does deserve a title shot, so I'm not going to begrudge anyone who says that he does, but I do just want to say that, and I do think his run is a little bit overrated. That being said, he's still a very, very good fighter. He's been a mainstay in the heavyweight division for well over a decade now, former world champion, of course. So look, Joseph Parker is an elite fighter. Well, maybe I shouldn't say elite, world-level fighter. And look, I think the way he's rebounded has been very impressive because I'll be frank, I thought after that Joe Joyce fight, he was done. So this is an interesting matchup, really. It is just a stay busy for Joseph Parker, in truth. And you have to favour him in this fight because, again, the technical ability that Joseph Parker has is just leagues and leagues above Fabio Wardley. Yes, Fabio Wardley has that equaliser, but you look at that Justis Huni fight that he's just had. Not only was he very clearly behind in that fight, I mean, on the judges' scorecards, I think it was like 82-89, something like that. You know, he was far down on that fight. He was down by like 7 rounds. So not only was he a mile down on the cards, he was getting really frustrated in there. He was forcing his work. And this is another thing you'd expect with a fighter who's less experienced. You could see, even when you're not landing your shots and you're not able to, you know, do exactly what you want to do in there, there would be a more relaxed kind of approach to things. But Fabio Wardley, in that fight, he was forcing his work. He was getting very uncomfortable. You could see he was getting incredibly frustrated. He had a very bad poker face. And it was one of those things where he caught Justis Huni, who, let's be honest, hasn't got a particularly good chin, in my opinion anyway. and he caught him good once, and there was a pretty fast count, if we're being honest, and that was that. That being said, I do think Justis Huni was very hurt. As I say, I don't think he necessarily holds the best shot. And look, Fabio Wardley punches very hard. But it's one of those ones where you look at the flaws in Fabio Wardley, and they were there for all to see in that fight. You know, against a better level of opposition, which Joseph Parker is, which even if somehow he lands on Joseph Parker, someone like Alexander Usyk certainly is, you know, you don't see Fabio Wardley necessarily even being able to get to the 10th, let alone being able to get into the 10th and then knocking his man out in that round. So, again, my whole feelings on this fight haven't really changed. I still lean quite heavily towards Joseph Parker. I kind of feel like maybe 70-30, something like that. Fabio Wardley does have a chance to win. Don't get, you know, Joseph Parker doesn't punch really, really hard or anything like that. So I don't think Fabio Wardley is going to get blown out early or anything like that. I do think that Joseph Parker is punching a little bit harder now he's with Andy Lee, in fairness. He seems to be sitting down on his shots a little bit better. I know he has put on a bit of weight, but I don't necessarily put that down to what's causing the knockouts. I think it's more the way he's sitting down on his shots. If you look, he's turning his knuckles over better. He's also had a lot of surgeries recently on things like his elbows to clean those up, and that seems to have helped in the way he kind of rotates and that kind of thing. So he's able to throw his punches with better technique. And so I think that's really where the power's coming from. But I don't think he's a thunderous one-punch Deontay Wilder kind of puncher. So I don't expect Fabio Wardley to get blown out early, even though Fabio Wardley does take risks and does get hit. Don't get it twisted. I think if he gets punched flush by Parker even early, I think he'll feel it. But, you know, I don't see this being a blowout or anything like that. I'd be very surprised if Joseph Parker goes in there in 2 or 3 rounds and just demolishes Fabio Wardley. For all of Fabio Wardley's technical flaws, I do think he's technically competent to be able to at least navigate the early rounds. But one thing Fabio Wardley has really struggled with is pacing. And again, that comes back to the lack of amateur schooling, really. And he gets very ragged, as I've said earlier, and he gets very tired. And that's when the form goes out the window as well. So I can see a world in which he gets very tired and starts to get broken down. And so I kind of see this as maybe sort of, I'm not going to say mid-round stoppage, probably more like late stoppage. So I can see Fabio Wardley probably getting taken out maybe in the 10th round. If not, I think he'll struggle and maybe survive like a knockdown or have a scare and then maybe make it to points and lose quite wide on the card, something like that. But I don't necessarily see this being I'll be honest, I don't see it being a particularly competitive fight. I don't think we're going to get to the end of the 12 rounds and we're going to be thinking, oh, who won that? I think it's going to be a case of we get to the 12 and it's very clear that Parker won, or, you know, and there's maybe a knockdown or so in there. Or we're going to get to, say, the 8th, 9th, 10th, and Wardley's just going to run out of steam and get stopped on accumulation, something like that. But you let me know what you think. It is still an intriguing fight, and it's still one of the better fights on the calendar this year, so I will be tuning in. But yeah, I'd be interested to know your thoughts, if there's anything you disagree with what I've said in this, or maybe there's something that you've seen that I haven't. And by all means, please let me know. I'd be really interested to know. But yeah, thank you very much, guys. Cheers, take care.